Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us for this next event in the speaker series put on by the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale Law School. It's great to have you here. I'm Daina Bray. I'm a senior litigation fellow with the Law, Ethics, and Animals program, and I'll be moderating today. This session will focus on the failure of regulatory oversight of U.S. slaughterhouses and on the interconnected harms that result to slaughterhouse workers, to animals, and to the environment. Our speakers today are Professor Winders and Dr. Abrell, who will describe this critical problem and propose a new regulatory framework in response, grounded in a rights-centered One Health approach. If you haven't read their article on this topic, I highly recommend it. It was published in the Health and Human Rights Journal in December 2021. And in that article, they discuss the timeliness of this issue and describe how the COVID-19 pandemic was transformative in this space. It shone a light on problems inside slaughterhouses. It aggravated the conditions of slaughterhouse workers. And at the same time, it gave industry cover to further disregard workers' interests and even to take steps that caused additional harms to animals and to the environment. So this is an important time for this discussion, and we can think about what have we learned through the pandemic, and we can think about ways to take advantage of this opportunity to rethink policy and our approaches to these important problems. I'll start by introducing our speakers very briefly. These are brief introductions that will not do them justice at all. Professor Delcianna Winders is truly a giant in the animal law field. She joins us from the Vermont Law and Graduate School, where she is the director of the Animal Law and Policy Institute. Delcy was previously a clinical professor at Lewis and Clark Law School, where she directed the world's first law school clinic dedicated to farmed animal advocacy. That clinic brought groundbreaking cases under Delcy's leadership, including a lawsuit against the USDA challenging the treatment of downed pigs or pigs who are too ill or injured to stand in slaughterhouses. So that's very relevant to our talk today. Professor Winders' primary interests are in animal law and in administrative law. Dr. Elan Abrell joins us from Wesleyan University, where he is an assistant professor of practice in the animal studies, environmental studies, and science and society programs. Dr. Abrell is a cultural anthropologist by training, with research interests in human-animal relations, environmental crises, and industrial agriculture. Before we jump into it, I wanted to reassure you that we will have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. As you have questions, you can submit them to me, Daina Bray, via the chat function. You'll find the chat function in the control bar at the bottom of your Zoom panel. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Abrell to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone in the audience for being here. It's a real honor to be able to join you today. I'm going to jump right into the action. So a damning report released October 27th, 2021 by the US House of Representatives Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus found that COVID-19 deaths and infections among slaughterhouse workers were up to 3 times higher than previously thought. That meatpacking employers prioritize profits and production over worker safety, and that the government agencies charged with protecting these workers failed to do so, and that minority workers were disproportionately impacted. The report was based on data from 5 of the largest meatpacking conglomerates: JBS, Tyson, Smithfield, Cargill, and National Beef. These companies make up 80% of the market for beef and over 60% of the market for pork in the United States. Specifically, it found, and here, these are some quotes from the report, across these 5 companies' respective workforces, at least 59,000 meatpacking workers were infected with the coronavirus during the first year of the pandemic, almost triple the 22,700 infections previously estimated by the Food and Environment Reporting Network for these 5 companies' respective workforces based on publicly available information. At least 269 meatpacking workers lost their lives to the coronavirus between approximately March 1st, 2020 and February 1st, 2021. Over 3 times higher than what was previously estimated by Fern for these 5 companies' respective workforces. The full extent of coronavirus infections and deaths at these meatpacking companies was likely much worse than these figures suggest, as the data provided to the select subcommittee in many instances excluded coronavirus cases confirmed by off-site testing or employee self-reported cases. These numbers alone don't convey the magnitude of callousness directed towards its workers by the meat industry. Consider the now infamous example of the Tyson Foods pig slaughterhouse in Waterloo, Iowa. When COVID-19 first came to Waterloo, it spread quickly through the communities of slaughterhouse workers and their families, many of whom are immigrants or refugees, as is also the case at many other slaughterhouses throughout the US. The impact of the Tyson outbreak was devastating to the city, though, disproportionately harming some of its most vulnerable community members. The desperation and fear of workers is palpable in their phone calls describing conditions at the slaughterhouse to State Legislator Ross Smith, who represents Waterloo's historically Black East Side. And this is a quote from him. A coworker vomited on the line and management let him continue to work. There are 8 people working in front of me and another 10 or more behind me. I am scared I will die because of work, but I need to work to buy food for my family, end quote. As of December 2020, over half the workers at the Waterloo slaughterhouse had been infected with the virus and 8 had died. With contact tracing, the cases tied to the Tyson outbreak were between 2,500 and 3,000, making it one of the largest, if not the largest, workplace outbreak in the country, at least at the time. Months later, the Waterloo plant was in the news once again when it was revealed that not only were supervisors lying to workers about their risk of exposure, but they were running a betting pool about how many workers would contract the virus. In August of this year, the United Food, so 2022 now, the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union released a report based on a year-long survey of workers in grocery stores and slaughterhouses that sheds more light on the ongoing impacts of the pandemic up until now. Some of its findings include that during survey to May 22nd, new monthly COVID infection rates rose from 2% to 15% among UFCW member respondents. These rates of infections were 10 times higher than US incident rates during the same period. UFCW essential workers who responded to the survey who got COVID before May 2021 were twice as likely to be reinfected in the past year. Approximately 20% of those who contracted COVID visited an emergency room. Of respondents infected with COVID, 59% believe they caught it at work. UFCW members infected with COVID had a higher rate of hospitalization, 6% of respondents, compared to the 2% national rate. And a full 4% of respondents who had been infected with COVID could not return to work at all. Many factors contributed to this public health disaster, but Delcy and I are focusing on an especially significant one today: the long history of failed oversight of the animal slaughter industry in the United States. Beyond its contributions to the spread of COVID in slaughterhouses, this failure negatively affects workers, animals, and the environment in multiple other ways as well. We argue that these regulatory failures are rooted in a conceptual failure to recognize the interconnection between human, animal, and environmental health and well-being, and the central role of legal rights in protecting them. And in response, as Delcy will explain in more detail, we propose a new regulatory framework governing the US slaughter industry that would prioritize protecting, strengthening, and enforcing rights to improve the health and well-being of both humans and animals. Before we elaborate on our proposal, I'm going to highlight some of the significant ways in which the inadequacies of the current regulatory system contribute to dangerous conditions for slaughterhouse workers, environmental degradation, and severe animal suffering. As the examples of mass COVID infections at US slaughterhouses suggest, slaughterhouses are incredibly dangerous places to work. Slaughterhouse workers work elbow to elbow, engaged in fast, repetitive movements with sharp tools. They are also regularly exposed to dangerous chemicals and high noise levels. Reports of amputations and hospitalizations are high. As the National Employment Law Project recently noted, according to self-reported industry data, which is recognized to be an undercount, quote, meat and poultry workers are injured at rates on average 50% higher than all other workers in the private sector, with injury rates in red meat plants running almost twice as high, end quote. Injuries are not only more prevalent, they are also more severe, even when compared to other dangerous industries. In addition, many workers suffer psychological harms that have been connected to, quote, increased rates of domestic violence, substance abuse, and post-traumatic stress disorder, end quote. The industry response to the pandemic is again illustrative of the industry's general disregard for worker safety. Despite the high risks posed to workers and their communities, slaughterhouses resisted providing even the most basic protections during the early months of the pandemic. A Washington Post investigation found that 3 of the largest meat processors in the United States, quote, failed to provide protective gear to all workers, and some employees say they were told to continue working in crowded plants even while sick, end quote. Meat companies took out full-page ads in major newspapers suggesting that Americans would face food shortages and skyrocketing prices if slaughterhouses weren't able to conduct business as usual during the pandemic, even as they exported record levels of meat abroad. When infections were so prevalent that slaughterhouses did not have enough people to maintain operations, companies resorted to bribing and threatening sick workers to get them to return to work, and obtaining permission from the United States Department of Agriculture to increase slaughter line speeds, even as the Center for Disease Control recommended line speed reductions, as faster line speeds require even closer quarters and have been linked to even higher rates of COVID-19 spread, in addition to higher injury rates. The government agencies that are supposed to protect workers from these harms failed to do so. Worse, in some instances, they actively facilitated harms. As former Occupational Safety and Health Administration Senior Policy Advisor Debbie Berkowitz details, OSHA denied an emergency petition to protect slaughterhouse workers and drastically reduced inspections, refusing to inspect slaughterhouses even in the face of repeated serious COVID-19 complaints. Meanwhile, the CDC softened safety recommendations in response to industry pressure. In one incident, a local health official tried to curb a COVID-19 outbreak at a slaughterhouse by temporarily shutting down operations, but the USDA intervened, contending that he had to allow the slaughterhouse to continue to operate and could not even investigate. Aside from workers, slaughterhouses also inflict serious harm to the environment. Slaughter is a resource-intensive, waste-extensive business. Furthermore, like its impact on workers, its environmental impacts are disproportionately borne by low-income communities, particularly communities of color. Federal data show that almost half of the slaughterhouses in the United States, quote, are in communities with more than 30% of their residents living beneath the poverty line, more than twice the national level. And a third are in places where at least 30% of the residents are people of color, end quote. Slaughterhouses are responsible for 29% of the agricultural sector's total freshwater consumption worldwide. This water consumption has a significant impact on wildlife and aquatic resources, which are then further exacerbated by increasing drought conditions driven by climate change. Slaughterhouses in the United States use billions of gallons of water annually, often discarding the used polluted water directly into waterways. A recent Environmental Protection Agency study found that the industry, quote, discharges the highest phosphorus levels and second highest nitrogen levels of all industrial categories, end quote. Slaughter pollutants also enter drinking water supplies via runoff and groundwater seepage from agricultural fields where slaughter facilities frequently spray their waste, resulting in a host of issues, including asthma attacks, autoimmune disorders, bacterial infections, birth defects, cognitive impairment in children, cancer, gastrointestinal problems, and miscarriages. These wastewater pollutants include organic matter such as blood and feces that carry pathogens like E. coli, antibacterial agents linked to a proliferation of antibiotic-resistant pathogens, pesticide residues, and high nutrient loads that cause algal blooms and dead zones in bodies of water. These are both fatal to aquatic life and dangerous to human health. Slaughterhouses also create large amounts of solid waste, including air pollution that can make it impossible for nearby residents to sit outside or open their windows, causes serious health problems, and contributes to climate change. Nonetheless, the USDA refuses to consider the environmental impacts of its slaughterhouse policies. And many slaughterhouses routinely violate even lax federal environmental standards with impunity. An analysis by the Environmental Integrity Project found that 3/4 of US slaughterhouses examined, quote, exceeded at least one of the pollution limits in their Clean Water Act permits, racking up a total of 1,142 separate violations for exceeding pollution limits, end quote, less than 1% of which had been resolved by the Environmental Protection Agency. In the very few cases that were resolved, the fines imposed were a minuscule fraction of the potential penalties, making them merely an acceptable cost of doing business for the slaughterhouses. Yet, in defending its refusal to consider the environmental impacts of its slaughterhouse policies, the USDA routinely points to slaughterhouses' obligation to comply with federal environmental policies. But the most immediate and perhaps worst suffering caused by slaughterhouses is, of course, inflicted on the animals themselves, as has been well documented through numerous undercover investigations, whistleblower reports, and government reports. Slaughterhouses, and I can go on with a much more graphic and worse list, but just a few points to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Slaughterhouses have been repeatedly documented throwing and hitting chickens, even ripping their bodies from their legs, as well as allowing fully conscious chickens to enter scald tanks intended to remove feathers from dead birds. These birds, about 1 million of them annually, according to USDA data, die from scalding or asphyxiation. All of this without enforcement actions from the USDA. Mammals also experience severe suffering at slaughterhouses, This includes being fully conscious when having their throat slit, when entering scald tanks, and even when being dismembered. I'll stop there because it gets to be kind of nauseating to look at all the ways that animals are suffer in slaughterhouses. But I'm going to pass it on to Delcy now to start discussing some of the ways to address these problems.
Thanks so much. And thank you for having us. And thank you everybody for being here. It's amazing to see so many people and to see names of people I want to catch up with. I wish we were in person, but I'm glad we're here. So what I'm going to talk about is how is it that this is happening? What laws and regulations are in place, and how is it that they're allowing this? And then turn to a discussion of what might we do to address it, and specifically to dive into the proposal that we made in the Harvard Health and Human Rights Journal. So slaughter is a relatively heavily regulated area, especially if you compare it to, say, on-farm treatment of animals raised for food, where there is literally no legal oversight whatsoever. There is a fair amount of oversight in the slaughterhouse. There has to be USDA inspection on site while they're operating, throughout the time they're operating. And yet all of this is happening. So I'm going to start with an overview of the laws that are in place and then talk about how things have gone wrong despite these laws. So with regard to animal protection, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, sometimes referred to as the Humane Slaughter Act, has been on the books since 1958. And that is a law that requires both the humane slaughter of animals, which is taken to mean rendering them unconscious before their throats are slit and before they're shackled up, and also humane handling of animals at slaughter. So getting them to the kill floor, basically. But that statute is very under enforced. The USDA's own Office of Inspector General has found enforcement problems with that law. A little over 20 years ago, Congress actually passed a resolution urging the USDA to enforce the law. And the resolution, quote, was expressing the sense of Congress that the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act of 1958 should be fully enforced so as to prevent needless suffering of animals. Nevertheless, it is not very well enforced, and there are some categories of animals who particularly suffer because of failings under the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. One are downed animals, who Daina mentioned at the beginning, the animals who arrive at slaughterhouses too sick or injured to stand or walk. They're particularly vulnerable at slaughter because they are basically, workers are incentivized to get them to the kill floor so they can enter the food supply, and they will resort to any measure. So that means often dragging animals, excessively electroshocking them. And then birds. Birds are by far the largest number of land animals who we slaughter for food. We slaughter more than 9 billion chickens alone in the United States every year. And the USDA has interpreted the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act to not cover birds. So they aren't even given these baseline protections. I should note that birds are given some humane handling protections under the Poultry Products Inspection Act, which does not itself in the statute explicitly refer to humane handling, but the USDA has determined that humane handling is tied to consumer food safety, which is the focus of that statute, and therefore they're going to regulate at least some humane handling under the Poultry Products Inspection Act. However, importantly, they only will take enforcement if a humane handling issue rises to the level of what they call a process control issue, meaning it's impacting a very large number of animals. And I should note, Harvard's Animal Law and Policy Clinic is challenging this on behalf of the Animal Welfare Institute. There's ongoing litigation related to that. But that is partly why, as Elan said, the USDA itself estimates that about 1 million chickens enter scald tanks fully conscious, fully alive every year. Pigs also enter scald tanks fully conscious, and that becomes more likely when line speeds are increased. In terms of environmental laws, the one I want to flag here is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. we're really just skimming the surface today. I have co-authored with Danny Replogle an article in Environmental Law that dives deep into the environmental impacts of slaughter deregulation specifically. But NEPA warrants attention because that statute requires federal agencies to consider the environmental impacts of their actions. And presumably that would include actions like speeding up slaughter, particularly when the agency itself determines that the result and indeed the goal of that deregulation is a significant increase in the number of animals slaughtered and farmed. We know that factory farming of animals has significant environmental impacts. Slaughter itself, as Elan mentioned, and as we go into more detail in the other article, also has significant environmental impacts. And yet the USDA, because it proclaimed itself to be categorically exempt from NEPA many years ago, and I should say specifically the sub-agency responsible for slaughter, Food Safety Inspection Service, has refused to do any NEPA analysis of any of its decisions, including its decisions to deregulate slaughter, despite explicitly recognizing the number of animals that will be, the increase in the number of animals that will be slaughtered. Then with regard to workers, the primary statute is OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And there are myriad challenges there. One of the big ones is that there's not a private right of action. A worker who is harmed by OSHA's failure to protect them cannot sue their employer directly. They are beholden to OSHA in the same way that the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act can only be enforced by the USDA. So that's the big picture regulatory framework. We have publications that go into more detail about it, but there are a lot of laws in place. And one of the outcomes of this all is that there have for many years been regulatory line speed limits in place, limits on how fast you can kill animals. And they're very fast. So 1,106 pigs per hour and 140 chickens per minute are the regulatory line speed limits. And so when we're talking about exceeding those limits, we're talking about killing animals even faster than that. And we don't mean to suggest that those speeds are acceptable. It should be slowed down significantly. But for years, there's been effort by industry and the USDA to speed that up even more. And this goes back a quarter century to 1997, when the US Department of Agriculture launched a pilot program to allow high-speed slaughter in a select number of slaughterhouses with the idea of studying to see the impacts. Fast forward 16 years later, in 2013, the USDA Office of Inspector General said that the USDA failed to properly evaluate the pilot projects. The whole point of a pilot project is to be evaluated, failed to disclose limits in information, and that faster line speeds raised worker safety concerns, including higher rates of carpal tunnel syndrome and other injuries, as well as food safety concerns, higher rates of food safety violations at high-speed slaughterhouses. The USDA allowed operations to continue at high speeds despite continual food safety violations. More recently, a Washington Post analysis of USDA records found that food contamination rates in high-speed slaughterhouses were more than double those at traditional speeds, and on and on. So this pilot program, to the extent it produced data, really suggested that this was not a good situation for these animals or the public, etc. So there were also undercover investigations of some high-speed slaughterhouses by Animal Outlook that documented pretty horrific conditions. And I think it's common sense that when you're pushing to work faster, to kill faster, every corner is going to be cut. Despite those failings observed by the Office of Inspector General, the USDA went ahead in 2017 and implemented a waiver system to allow more chicken slaughterhouses to increase their line speeds. They did this without engaging in notice and comment rulemaking, and they did this without any NEPA analysis, which is the same for all of these actions that I'm going to talk about. And then in 2019, they finalized a rule to allow all pig slaughterhouses to opt out of the regulatory line speed limit. And that was despite massive opposition. And the USDA explicitly said that this will allow the slaughter of more animals. They estimated 11.5 million more pigs annually, and that will increase profits. That was the impetus. That was the primary goal of the rule. No consideration of environmental impacts, no consideration of worker impacts, minimal consideration of animal impacts. The USDA then announced its plans to do the same sort of rulemaking for chicken slaughterhouses, and submitted that rule to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs on the eve of Biden's inauguration. So in the waning days of the Trump administration, and my clinic was able to get together a coalition of organizations, and a lot of people met with OIRA about that, and the rule was withdrawn. There were also numerous lawsuits challenging the rule increasing pig slaughter line speeds, including one brought by my clinic and one brought by worker organizations, successfully got that piece of the rule revoked. And the USDA's response to that was to initiate a new waiver program. And so we have a quote unquote new pilot program whereby the 6 slaughterhouses, all of which were part of the original pilot program, are now being allowed to operate at higher speeds, again, with no consideration of environmental impacts, very little consideration of animal impacts, lip service to worker impacts, but some real concerns that have been raised about how seriously those are being considered. Just to illustrate how little consideration was given to animal impacts, one of those 6 slaughterhouses, Quality Pork Producers in Minnesota, is one that Animal Outlook conducted an undercover investigation at and documented a slew of violations, including a worker saying, we don't have time to handle them more quickly because we're operating so fast. We don't have time to treat them more humanely because we're operating so quickly. And the USDA is planning to do the same sort of new pilot program for birds as well. So what can we do about this? There's so many regulatory failures, and that means there are a lot of things that we can do. We need at a minimum to continue monitoring this, opposing it, challenging it, commenting when they're rulemaking, suing the agency. I'm working on a report that's going to be published by our Center for Agriculture and Food Systems here at Vermont Law and Graduate School next year. That's going to propose some specific policy changes the USDA can make. Our farmed animal advocacy clinic here at Vermont Law and Graduate School is also working on some specific pieces of this, including that NEPA loophole that's been on the books for way too long. But this is also an opportunity to take a step back and think about this more holistically and imagine what might we do to meaningfully regulate this industry. And one of the fundamental shortcomings is that these interests, the animal interest, environmental interest, worker interest, community interests, are very much bound up. That's true in general in life. You can't really separate human, environmental, animal interests, but slaughterhouses exemplify that so much. And COVID-19 really shone a light on it, as Daina said, and as we say in the beginning of our paper. And so there are some real fundamental limitations of relying on USDA as a primary agency for regulating this. I mean, the Inspector General has flagged some of those concerns. Its primary mandate is to promote agriculture, so it's not very inclined to be an enforcement body. It's not prioritizing workers or animals or the environment or communities that live near these facilities, and it has failed to coordinate with other agencies. So we certainly can think about, whether a different agency should be in place, and we should, but also we need a fundamentally new regulatory approach. We need a different paradigm to govern our framework for how we're going to go about regulating these, and one that recognizes that these interests are interconnected. And so what Elan and I have proposed is using an expanded, rights-centered One Health framework. So what does that mean? So One Health, as most of you probably have some sense of, is a public health policy approach that's based on recognizing the interconnected interests of humans, animals, and the environment. And that it's been around for quite a while now. It's also been co-opted quite badly. One notable example is the One Health certified product you can find on chicken and turkey products now. But at its core, it is a policy approach that recognizes interconnected interests. And as a way of keeping One Health grounded in its original vision and goals, we've proposed having an overlay of a fundamental prioritization of rights and justice. And so what do we mean by that? By rights, we mean basic things like the right to be free from cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment, just and favorable work conditions, to health and a healthy environment. And we recognize that there is a real tension in talking about rights in the context of slaughter, which is contrary to the most fundamental interests of animals. And we recognize that these harms that we're talking about are only going to be fully eliminated if we end industrial slaughter of animals. However, we do think that a regulatory approach that attends to the interconnected interests could effectuate real meaningful harm reduction and also serve as a platform on which we could build more robust protections. So we've proposed as a first step, a Slaughterhouse Oversight Commission, basically a federal body that be tasked with investigating this issue, reporting on this issue, making recommendations, and using this holistic lens of looking at interconnected interests. And we think having a federal oversight commission is important for a number of reasons. One, they're going to have more access to information, including through subpoena power. And that's how we got some of that information from the subcommittee that Elan mentioned before. It was only through their abilities to subpoena the slaughter companies that it came to light that the extent of COVID in slaughterhouses was even greater than we thought it was. A federally situated oversight commission is also well positioned to facilitate cross-agency communication and collaboration, which is really critical here, and is going to have more weight when they give recommendations. So NGOs are doing a lot of this work already, and they're doing a great job, but it's going to be more persuasive coming from a federal commission. And there's certainly precedent for commissions like this. There's a Marine Mammal Commission, U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and others. Admittedly, none that are focused on a real interconnected, interdisciplinary approach, but we've also never been in a moment where the interconnected interests are so clear and the interconnected harms call out for attention so much. So I will end there and look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Winders and Dr. Abrell. That was a really excellent overview of such a timely and important topic. Thank you also for your groundbreaking work on slaughterhouses. As we've talked about today, this is an issue in a space that has avoided scrutiny in so many ways and has avoided adequate regulatory oversight, as you've set out today. So thank you for your really important work on this topic. I'm glad to see we already have some questions in the chat. We have plenty of time. I want to encourage you all to submit questions to my attention in the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can. And I'm going to start first talking about your talk today in the article focuses on federal oversight for all of the reasons that you've said why that would be necessary. There is some state level regulation in this area, which we haven't talked about, and there's a lot of state variety in this area, everything from, oversight schemes in some states to other states that don't even have basic meat inspection requirements. So I'd love to hear what role, if any, do you envision for state level regulation and policy in this area?
Yeah, I can start, and then Elan, if you want to add anything. So the main reason we focused on the federal level is that the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act, which are the main statutes governing slaughter, both have very strong express preemption provisions. And the US Supreme Court, in a case I worked on when I was a baby lawyer, National Meat Association versus Kamala Harris, upheld that preemption provision as being very broad and very strong. So in that case, California had passed a law trying to protect downed pigs because the federal government had failed to do so, despite many years of introduced legislation. And that law was deemed to be preempted by federal law. And so basically, any activity starting at when the truck starts to approach the slaughterhouse gates from then on is governed by federal law, and any state law that is not only, stricter, but different in any way from the federal law is preempted. And so if you have a state law that's identical to the federal law, like a state cruelty law that isn't enhancing the requirements, there certainly is space for federal enforcement, and there have been calls for that. And PETA routinely does that when there are humane handling violations and the USDA doesn't do anything meaningful. But even there, where there is not true preemption, the local authorities are not inclined to do much. And so that's the main reason. For any slaughterhouse that's selling products in interstate commerce, they're regulated under these federal statutes, and there's really broad preemption. There is a push, especially lately, to increase the number of small slaughterhouses, and those might only serve a market within a state and thus not be subject to these federal laws, and there could be more space for this. And so there might be something worth exploring, but you have to understand that there's a really small number of very large slaughterhouses that are killing most of the animals that Americans eat. And so that includes the animals from the purportedly better welfare facilities. They're still going to these same slaughterhouses for the most part. Another thing that's worth noting is that smaller slaughterhouses are not necessarily better. I mean, what we've described is very egregious. When you're operating this quickly, really significant harms happen. However, some of the most egregious humane handling violations I've seen documented have been at smaller slaughterhouses. They tend to have older equipment. They tend to not be trained as well. And so it can just be really sloppy. I mean, there's a small slaughterhouse in Oregon that falsely represents itself as certified for humane care of animals, and is a facility that a lot of better welfare farms send their animals to. And they have been cited for not properly stunning animals, for animals needing to be shot in the head 2, 3, 4, 5 times before they're rendered unconscious. And so I think we need to be careful about assuming that smaller is going to be better also.
Yeah, I don't have much to add other than just to what Delcy was saying about the federal preemption issue is also just this, I think, thing that we're all aware of now, which is the Supreme Court, which seems to be pretty not amenable to regulations in general. And I'm assuming a lot of people in this audience are kind of waiting to see what happens with how they respond to the Proposition 12 case in California. So that could also create problems for what we're proposing, but at least a federal body might have some authority that state efforts wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just want to pick up on that quickly. Yeah, that all of, this uncertainty about the Dormant Commerce Clause is yet another reason to really look to the state. But also, and I know you all had a Prop 12 panel that I missed, but I think it's worth flagging that the Pork Industries Council at oral argument continually suggested that labeling could resolve this issue. The Federal Meat Inspection Act governs labeling, and it has a very strong preemption provision, and it has one that the national pork producers has been in court recently pushing to be even broader to address all advertising of pork products. So it was incredibly disingenuous for them to suggest that this could be resolved through labeling, but that's another topic.
Very interesting. Thank you. We have a question from the audience about your use of the rights language. And the question is, why is it important to make this a rights-based framework And why are you choosing that path? How is that different from just focusing on a regulatory approach without baking in the rights approach?
You want me to start, Elan? Yeah, I think a big piece of it is that historically, the interests that are supposed to be protected by these various statutes, the environment, workers, animals, have not gotten adequate attention. And the industry, the agency has largely been at the beck and call of industry. And there's a very clear revolving door. And so because there is no private right of action, there's no means for these other interests to enforce their interests and bring challenges when there are harms to them, they're always at a disadvantage, and they're always at the mercy of the agency, which has historically for many years, and still, I have to say, even under the current administration, done the bidding of industry. A rights framework is going to be a way to really allow those interests to more meaningfully seek enforcement. Because if you just have a regulatory regime that again is completely in the hands of a regulatory body, if we have a truly independent agency, that's going to be a better situation. But no, there's no right without a remedy, right? That's very classic law school 101. And so you need some ability to actually enforce this if it's going to be meaningful.
Yeah, and I would just add to the at the more theoretical level, I guess, I wanted to give a shout out and a thanks to Dr. Hope Delcianna at the Phoenix Zone Initiative, because she's one of the co-editors of the special issue this was in, and we're inspired by and engaging with an idea that their organization works with, which is a much more rights integrated approach to One Health called Just One Health. We didn't feel like what we're proposing fit that exactly, since it still involves animals being slaughtered, and that's obviously a huge rights violation for the animals. But the idea that if these remedies for the integrated needs and harms that are inflicted on the environment, humans, and other animals are going to be effective, they're going to need to be grounded in rights for all the reasons that Delcy just said.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a number of questions which touch on the theme of advocating at the same time for workers and for the environment and for animals, and how those things, can work together and enhance each other, or perhaps take attention away from vital aspects of each of those fights. So I get one of the questions is, if you're, if you are someone who's interested in raising awareness of what's going on inside slaughterhouses, what's the best way to advocate around these issues and to acknowledge the different needs that workers have and that animals have and the different impacts on the environment, without undermining any of those very important interests? How have you approached balancing those constituencies?
You want me to start again?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's an important question. I think the industrial animal agriculture industry is harming all of these interests. The only one who's benefiting from industrial animal agriculture and specifically slaughter deregulation is the small handful of multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations. And in fact, in the rulemaking about the rule to increase pig slaughter line speeds, the USDA acknowledged that the only ones who supported it were industry, like specific slaughterhouses, industry interest groups, and a small handful of private citizens. And so if we work together, if everyone who's harmed by this industry works together to challenge the harms that the industry is inflicting, we're going to be a lot more powerful. We're going to be able to get a lot more done. And if the industry is forced to internalize the costs that it's been allowed to externalize for so long, and that's true for any kind of cost, worker harms, environmental harms, animal harms, that's all going to make this industry less tenable on an ongoing basis, and is going to operate to the benefit ultimately of everyone who's being harmed. And so, you know, you can't separate out these impacts. Like, they actually are intertwined, and the most effective way to go about addressing them is going to be working together. And there's been some really amazing, beautiful coalition work that's come about in response to the slaughter deregulation and the COVID impacts. Some groups that didn't really work together before came together, and I hope that that will continue and expand, because we got a really big Goliath, and we can do a lot working together.
I agree with all of that. I think I would throw in too that, you know, just to put it simply, there's no siloed solution to integrated oppression. So we can't, even if we wanted to, we couldn't just reach in and pull out animal exploitation out of the mix and just leave everything else the way it is. But also, I kind of, well, I try to approach this thinking about it in terms of culture change, I guess, because I'm contaminated by anthropology in my brain, and so that's how I think about things. But there are people who are going to be persuaded by a lot of the things that we were acknowledging in the first half of our paper, who might not be persuaded by an argument about animal welfare. And if the approach is to assume that the audience is universal and we just need to make them all care about one particular issue, it's probably not going to work. And it hasn't thus far. So I think there's sort of a, I guess you could say, a rhetorical element to how you approach it too, which is looking at the integrated oppressions appeals to a much broader audience of concerned people who might then want to become involved in what we're trying to change.
Thank you. Those are great thoughts. And Elan, I have to confess, I'm also contaminated by anthropology, and I focused on it as an undergrad. So it's a good thing to be, I think. We have a question about unionization in the industry, and the question is whether you know how much of the industry is unionized, and if so, whether unions are involved in filing grievances on health and safety concerns, and whether there's an avenue for the unions to do more to draw attention to these issues.
Yeah, so I don't have the exact numbers. It's a little bit outside my expertise, but there is strong unionization in certain sectors of the slaughter market, and there has been really fantastic advocacy by the union. So the UFCW was, and 3 local chapters, was the one that brought the lawsuit that resulted in the District Court of Minnesota vacating the revocation of line speed limits for pigs, precisely because of the USDA's failure to consider impacts on workers. And the new pilot program actually requires some sort of agreement with the union, if there is one, or the workers otherwise. And so there has been work by the unions. Not all of the slaughterhouses are unionized, and there has been some critique and concern about how far the unions are willing to go in terms of cooperating with industry. I think we'll need to see what the outcome of this current pilot program is, if there's any sort of reliable data that it actually generates. But unions have been active in this space, and I would say leaders here.
Great, thank you. This is a resource question. A member of the audience is wondering whether there are any scholars that have looked at cross-cultural baselines for guidelines for slaughter, including halal and kosher, and if you know of any international resources, scholarship on that topic.
I will say, I know that Kristen Stilt at Harvard Law School is doing a lot of work around halal slaughter specifically, and has a book coming out on that. But beyond that, I don't know. And it sounds like the question is beyond legal scholarship, which is all I know these days. So anthropologists, I'm going to punt to you.
Well, yeah, I can't think of any anthropologists off the top of my head, but also, I don't know if she's still in the audience, but Alice DiConcetto at the Center for Animal, sorry, I'm blanking. I'm trying to look up the name of her organization right now. And unfortunately she's muted. I thought I had it, but CCCB. Sorry, I won't take up more time trying to look on the internet right now, but Alice is an expert on European animal law issues, and she might have some resources or just be aware of these comparisons.
Thank you. We have another question. The audience member says that you focused a lot on labor law and how labor law has failed to protect workers in this area and has facilitated industry's treatment of workers. This is a big question, but are there any other examples that you'd like to share about how other areas of the law help structure and protect the animal agriculture industry? Criminal law, immigration law, antitrust law? Is there any sort of exceptional treatment of the industry that you would like to highlight? Pick your poison.
Animal agriculture exceptionalism pervades every single area of the law, literally every single area of the law. And so the laws that apply to you and me and to most industries, animal agriculture has been carved out of them. They get different treatment under all of the laws that were just mentioned. The other, and we haven't talked about, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, immigration laws. At the state level, there are right to farm laws that are protecting them from nuisance suits that everyone else would be subjected to. So it's really hard to pick a poison. Cruelty laws, they're carved out from there. And so our laws have really been structured in a way, not even just to turn a blind eye to what this industry is doing, but to actually actively facilitate its profits. And its profits are the profits of a very small handful of corporations. I mean, they have been making record profits at the expense of everybody else in the ways that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would just add that there's even ways in which the law helps benefit and facilitate those profits without even appearing to directly be related to animal agriculture. So immigration laws make a vulnerable population of workers for the industry that's a part of their business structure. They rely on it, and they know that that's the case, and they lobby for more draconian immigration laws so that they can have more exploitable workers. So it benefits the animal industry. Exceptionalism pervades all the law, like Delcy said, and then there are parts of the law that are contributing to it that don't even seem to be directly related.
Thank you both. Those are really helpful answers. I'll just relay a comment from the audience saying that Dr. Michelle Sinclair at the Harvard Animal Law Program has a paper in prep on cross-cultural attitudes to slaughter, including religious slaughter. So watch that space. So thank you very much for that addition. This is a question, there's often in policymaking and in political life, there's a calculation that goes on of weighing the benefits of stronger protections for the environment or for animals against the economic costs of implementing those protections. And right now, the national conversation is focused a lot on the economic fallout of the pandemic, on inflation, on whether we are headed into a recession. So right now in this moment, this is a question about political will or lack of political will. What advice would you give to advocates who would like to work on animal and environmental issues along with labor issues in this space in this moment? How can politicians' minds be focused?
I mean, I think emphasizing these interconnected impacts is a really powerful way to approach politicians, because I'm not exaggerating when I say it's a small handful of multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations. They are profiting and they're taking that profit for themselves. It's not like they're reinvesting it in the communities that they're inflicting environmental justice harms on. And so, unless our priority is to allow the biggest corporations to make the most profits at the expense of everybody else, there's not a reason to continue to facilitate their externalization of costs. And I think the fact that they're harming everybody in their wake is a really persuasive argument for increased regulation. And there are some bills that have been introduced to try to address that, and that do recognize these interconnected interests. So I think that emphasizing the interconnected harms is a really powerful lobbying tool.
Yeah, I agree with Delcy. And I would add that we see across multiple industries that are wreaking havoc on the planet, the use of immediate economic crisis as a way to leverage or blackmail not doing things that we all know need to be done. So this is like happening with the petroleum industry right now. Gas prices go up. Biden decides to release a bunch of petroleum from the National Oil Reserve. But I think in addition to like emphasizing these interconnected harms, like Delcy's saying, there has to be a real resistance to leaning into that kind of blackmail, because we can't keep putting off changing things because there's an emergency. Capitalism creates crises. It does that better than really anything else it does, other than make profits for people at the top. So there's going to be more crises as long as we keep functioning in this system, economically, I mean. But if we want to stop the environmental crises and all of the other problems that the industries are causing, we have to continuously insist on changing those things, even when it's hard, even when you can point to like people are struggling because prices are up. Because like Delcy was pointing out, that there are other ways of addressing the costs of food other than increasing line speeds. If we got rid of the externalities of the industry, if we subsidize better ways of eating and cheaper ways of providing protein and calories to people that don't involve animals. I mean, there's a lot of people working on that right now, which is fantastic, but there has to be a will at the policy level and the government level to switch towards those things too. So I think keeping the pressure on there is important.
And just to briefly piggyback on that, I think it's important to understand that this current approach is digging us deeper. We are killing more animals than ever before in human history. We're eating more animals per capita than ever before in human history. And it's speeding up slaughter is largely facilitating that. And it's aggravating the climate situation, and it's preventing other products, more environmentally products, from being on a level playing field. And so if we're going to address these crises, then we need to, that's yet another reason we need to do this, to ensure that there's a level playing field.
Thank you both. I think we have time for one more question, and we do have a question about the proposal for a federal slaughterhouse oversight commission. And the question is whether there's been interest in that idea from policymakers, whether you've been able to make any efforts to gather information from different agencies and sort of test the waters about this idea. Are there any developments you can share about the commission proposal?
So it's still in pretty early stages. So we published the paper and we've done a few talks like this, and we have garnered some interest from that, but we have not, frankly, had time to take it to the next step. We are planning to do that. I think we're wanting to flesh out more concretely what we think it should look like, and then try to engage policymakers, but we have not yet had time to do that. But it's on the list, and if people are interested, please reach out.
Thank you both for your work in this area and for spending time with us today. This was really educational. There was a lot of, the audience was very engaged. I apologize I couldn't get to all the questions because there were so many great questions. I wanted to remind everyone that this talk has been recorded and it will be posted on the Law, Ethics, and Animals Program YouTube channel where you can view it. If you're not signed up to receive emails from LEAP, you can sign up to do that on our website and you'll get a notification when the video has been posted. Thank you both, Delcy and Elan, for joining us today. It was a really enlightening session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.